Hello everyone, welcome again to another episode of Policy Beats. Today I am joined with Professor Samina Yasmin. She heads the Department of International Relations, Asian Studies and Politics in University of Western Australia, School of Social Sciences. She is a teacher and a researcher and director and founder of the University Center for Muslim States and Societies. She focuses on understanding perceptions of and by Muslims and Islam around the world and seeks to make an impact on Australian and global politics. Thank you so much, ma'am. आपने हमारे लिए टाइम निकाला और आप हमारे शो पर आई. How do you do?
बिल्कुल ठीक, आप सुनाइए.
Again, it's lovely to have you. I think सबसे पहले तो मैं आपसे ये जानना चाहूँगी कि you are an international relations expert, or do you identify as a social scientist, even though I said your bio. But I think it is important कि आप अपनी थोड़ी सी जर्नी के बारे में बताएं कि today as you are, how did you end up coming to study this particular subject? What was that particular moment जिस पे आपने कहा कि अच्छा मुझे ये करना?
मैंने शुरू तो किया था होम इकोनॉमिक्स से.
अच्छा जी.
और बैचलर्स करने के बाद मतलब बचपना था, लेकिन मैंने कहा नहीं अब ये नहीं करना, इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस करना है. तो मेरी अम्मी ने ख़ास परमिशन ली सेक्रेटरी ऑफ एजुकेशन से उन दिनों, डॉक्टर अजमल से, कि जी इसे टेस्ट के लिए रहने दें और अगर इफ़ यू पासिस देन लेट हर डू इट. तो देन आई स्टार्टेड इस्लामाबाद यूनिवर्सिटी एंड इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस मेरा बेसिक था.
ओके.
और उसी की वजह से फिर मैं गई ऑस्ट्रेलियन नेशनल यूनिवर्सिटी में for another master's. Here I got a scholarship to study at the University of Tasmania.
Okay.
But mostly based in Canberra at the Australian National University. तो मेरा thesis था China-Pakistan relations पे. और जब मैं लिख रही थी तो मुझे आहिस्ता आहिस्ता आइडिया हुआ कि जी even China, which looked at Pakistan from a very strategic point of view, had taken into account Muslim connection, Pakistan's Muslim identity, in selecting Pakistan as an ally. So then I thought, achha, there's something to do with religion. So when I got the job at the University of Western Australia, as I started teaching, I got more and more aware of the fact कि जी हम क्या हैं, हम कैसे सोचते हैं. That's very important. और हमारी आइडेंटिटीज़ क्या हैं. और उसमें रिलीजन है, यू कांट टेक इट अवे. तो मैंने रिलीजन एंड स्पेशली इस्लाम पे काम अर्ली 1990s में शुरू किया था.
The right time.
When people were not even talking about it. But I started doing that, and then university gave me the option of offering a course on Islam and world politics. तो करके फिर आहिस्ते आहिस्ते मुझे फिर और भी एहसास हुआ कि जी मुस्लिम्स जो हैं अगर दुनिया में जहाँ पे भी हैं उनके व्यूज़ अबाउट बीइंग वेयरएवर दे आर वेरी डिफरेंट. तो वो समझना चाहिए. तो वो समझते समझते फिर मैंने कहा इफ़ वी रियली वांट टू अंडरस्टैंड तो वी नीड अ सेंटर फॉर मुस्लिम स्टेट्स एंड सोसाइटीज़. सो जो फोकस करें सिर्फ मुस्लिम थियोलॉजी पे नहीं, लेकिन मुस्लिम कंट्रीज़ कैसे ऑपरेट करती हैं, उनमें रिलीजन का क्या रोल है, but also Muslim communities, people like me who go overseas and spend most of their life there, but retain a link with their country of origin. So that's where I think again I was very lucky that the Vice Chancellor at that time supported the idea. So we set up the Center for Muslim States and Societies, and the university has been very supportive all these years. So now it's in the School of Social Sciences. So that's how I got to that. So, of course, the 9/11 happened.
Exactly.
This whole question was still being considered, and then London bombing happened. And then, of course, everyone started realizing. So that's really my trajectory. But all along this period, what I've really become more and more focused on is realizing कि एक तो pure strategic calculations होती हैं. They play a role in how countries operate, how people operate. But then there are more sort of ideational aspects that determine what people are and how countries behave or operate. And that if you don't understand that, then you really reduce international relations to a simple mathematical.
If this state does this, it will
Then,
do that,
yeah.
and then so on.
But
That
the
is too
reality
simplified.
Reality is very different.
Yes.
So I'm sort of very passionate about understanding how people's thinking of who they are really shapes what they do, and also what countries do. And although my initial focus was and still is about Muslims, so I've gradually also started looking at how other religious communities look at themselves and how Muslims and non-Muslims look at each other.
Ma'am, this is very interesting because for people who would study sociology, they would be interested to know, okay, then how does a certain cult-like movement play around with it? Because everyone today seems to have a different understanding of religion. Some would probably just reduce it to beliefs, some would just reduce it to practices, and others would take a holistic approach जो एक हम sociological definition भी देखते हैं religion की कि it has to be organized, certain values, there's people who adhere to it, and then you have a certain leadership that people look up to, dead or alive, that sort of runs the belief system perhaps. It's interesting that you mentioned ke sari identities, how do we perceive ourselves, how are we perceived then in terms of how states perceive each other. I would like to learn then कि थोड़ा सा अगर आप एक generic understanding हमें दे सकें when it comes to the process of identity, and then on top of that when you layer it with things like religion, how does that come into play in politics?
So I guess when we talk about, at least in my view, talk about identity, we're really talking about identities.
Okay.
Because, everyone knows that we're not just one, we're many.
Right, I could be a Pakistani, I could be just a woman, I could be a Muslim Pakistani, a Muslim woman, and you keep adding layers to it.
You're a daughter.
You're a daughter.
You're a sister. You could be a mother. You would be a wife. You could be a teacher. Those sari identities, you're basically sum total of that.
Okay.
And you place yourself in relationship to others depending upon what dimension of identity you're looking at. So if you're a teacher, you're looking at yourself not just as a woman, but as a teacher who is relating to the students who get guided by you. In the same way, when you're talking to your mother or your father, you're a different person. Their dimensions are different. So I think once we accept that there are multiple identities, or there are multiple dimensions in which we can look at, the next question that I'm always focused on is, how do we get to that point? Who are we? What forces drive us to be in a particular way?
Okay.
कि Samina Yasmin क्यों है जवेरिया क्यों नहीं है?
What factors build you up?
Yeah. So I think, I don't want to personalize it, but when you look at people, when you look at individuals or communities, I realize that although what you said, religion is an organized
some definitions would.
Yeah, so some definitions too. But when you really go to the crux of it, everyone's reading what those broader principles are very different. There may be some similarities, but bringing into play your background, your learning, who taught you, how they taught you, the schools you went to, the friends you had, the information you used, all that becomes the building context in which you develop your identity. They're inputs that convert you into looking at the world in a particular way. So given the fact that not everyone's experience is the same or the bringing up is the same, so effectively when we're looking at place of religion in a person's life or persons' lives, we can't expect uniformity. Not all Muslims look at the world in the same way. Not all Christians look at it in the same way. Not Jews look at the world in the same way. Not all Hindus look at it in the same way. So this religious identity has built into it diversity. So I basically think about, and in that I sort of draw upon a model that I think I've never been able to work out how to pronounce his name, Michael Brecker, I think. He developed a model based upon trying to understand Israeli foreign policy with some other young female scholar. जब मैं उस मॉडल को देखती थी ना, even when I was studying international relations, तो उसमें था कि जी मुख्तलिफ countries when they shape their foreign policy, the leaders are in a particular way, but there's an information about the global scene, information about the domestic scene, but how that same picture is interpreted by that person is really shaped by what influences that person has already been exposed to. So जब मैं religion की तरफ देखना शुरू किया ना, especially when the center was set up and we started doing research, building on the research we'd already been doing, but doing research as part of the National Action Plan. So I was very careful to see how different reading of the global developments and local developments shape how people think of themselves based upon what the influences they have in their lives. उनकी माँ ने उन्हें क्या सिखाया, उनके वालिद ने उन्हें क्या सिखाया, उनके दोस्तों ने क्या उन्हें सिखाया, उन्होंने कौन सी movies देखी. So all that, so I guess the way I look at it is that when we're looking at individual identities, we can't separate that from the influences and then different reading of the global and local developments and how they're funneled in our brains by people, then really shapes what we do. तो आपको वही development आप देखेंगे तो आप कहेंगे कि नहीं भी इसका reaction जो है ना जोर शोर से देना होगा. मैं वो देखूंगी और मैं कहूँगी कि नहीं,
could be timid, could be ignored.
And even if we have to take note of that, we need to do it in a very considered manner. For example, blasphemy. So, when they are, living in Australia, but also knowing what happens elsewhere, there are people who consciously try and hurt feelings of Muslims because either they think there's freedom of speech and that permits them, or because they just have got some anti-Muslim ideas and they think, okay, if this is where it hurts, that's what we're going to do. So I just think when people react to it by using violence, that's their reading.
Great. And not what caused it.
Yeah. But it's not my reading. So when I look at it based upon how I was brought up and what I read, thanks to my mother, and then later on with my really wonderful teachers who've taught me over a period of time, all of them together then get me to think, Tika, what they did was wrong, but you don't take the violent route. Okay. You argue with them. Or sometimes you don't even argue with them. You promote an understanding of that alternative meaning given to Islam and make people realize that hurting someone's sensibilities or sensitivities is not freedom of speech. तो वो लिंक है इस बात से कि हम दो मुख्तलिफ लोग मुख्तलिफ किस्म के इन्फ्लुएंसेस से एक सिचुएशन को देख रहे हैं और फिर कहते हैं इसके साथ हम क्या करें. Do we engage with it? Do we oppose it? Do we remain neutral?
Okay.
Do we just give up the scene and go away?
Ma'am, there's a lot to unpack in what you have said. And chota sa anecdote on my end too. कि when my teacher used to teach us foreign policy के courses या international relations, तो एक बात वो हमेशा कहते थे, who's the person running the show? See what their beliefs are. See what schooling they have been to. And उस टाइम पे शायद वो चीज़ इतनी हमें समझ नहीं आती थी कि नहीं करना तो उनने वही है जो उनकी पॉलिसी लाइन है. लेकिन वो हमेशा ये कहते थे कि if Blinken's currently leading or anyone else is in the house right now, you read their profile and then you will understand their reactions, how internally क्या debate चलती होगी और externally इस तरह की बात अगर हो रही है तो क्यों हो रही है, what influences all of this. वैसे तो हम normally institutions को पढ़ रहे होते हैं और जो भी मतलब bigger actors that are involved, organization level पे चीज़ें देखते हैं, but we tend to miss out on that that individual perhaps outlook on different things, and perhaps it's the same with identity. अक्सर हम identities को भी from a state perspective देखेंगे, या from a very different approach media के उससे देख लेंगे, लेकिन never being able to understand identity from an identity perspective. I could be wrong in articulating what I said, but so there's a lot that you said, and I have so many questions now, because then you also spoke of freedom of expression versus Islamophobia, how people are pursuing their beliefs basically in action or in thought. तो यहाँ पे मैं फिर थोड़ा सा चाहूँगी कि आप हमें explain करें कि given at a point where we are now, we'd like to say कि we're a globalized society, and फिर एक तरफ हमारी डिस्कशन ये भी जाती है कि we're also going back to being a less globalized society. We want to go back to our roots. उस तरह की मूवमेंट्स को हम अक्सर पॉपुलिज्म का नाम दे देते हैं या एंटी समथिंग का नाम दे देते हैं. I want to understand, how did Islamophobia become so big? Was 9/11 perhaps the only driving force behind it, or was it something in the making that we did not, come to an understanding of? Because थोड़ी सी एक और मेरी अपनी पर्सनल लेवल पे भी I want to understand कि जब हम इस्लामिक सिविलाइजेशन की गोल्डन एज की बात करते हैं तो वो बहुत पुरानी है. वो तो मेरी हिस्ट्री बुक में भी बहुत मुश्किल से मेंशन होती है, और अगर होती है तो हम लोग इतना ज़्यादा नहीं पढ़ते जितना हम यूरोसेंट्रिक हिस्ट्री पढ़ते हैं, उनकी जंगें पढ़ते हैं, उनकी लीडर्स, उनकी स्ट्रैटेजीज़, राइट. तो आई थिंक एक तरफ हमारे करिकुलम का रोल भी वहाँ पे चल रहा है. दूसरे एंड पे पॉलिटिकल इस्लाम से रिलेटेड भी पूछना चाहूँगी कि उस पर जो फोकस आया, एंड जिस तरह वो आया भी बहुत एक नेगेटिव नॉन स्टेट एक्टर्स के हाथों. So what are your comments on that? Basically, how have you seen the trends of political Islam in these years? I've asked too many questions at once.
Okay, so let me see if I don't answer every one of them. Just remind me again. पहली बात तो ये है कि जी, was Islamophobia there before or not?
Okay.
Okay, so before 9/11. So if we go back into history of how Muslims were perceived, not when they were at the height of their power, but later on, as they were colonized, what is it that the Western colonizers learned about them? तो एक मेरे पास उधर किताब है जो मैंने पता नहीं कहाँ से, कोई पुरानी सी किताब, about Arabian Nights, I think. तो उसमें आप देखें ना तो तस्वीरें जो मुसलमानों की, वो बड़ी romanticized, something, what people have drawn attention to. Edward Said would say, this is not understanding, it's Orientalism. तो वो जो Orientalist thought थी ना कि जी, somehow Muslims are not developed, and they've got this really different way of being, and that's what we have to understand. So you understood Muslims from a point of view of superiority and Muslims as being different.
Okay.
But once decolonization started and people started moving into different parts of the world, more so than they ever did before, it wasn't Islamophobia, it was misunderstanding, not fear of Islam. But then it gradually started building up they're different.
I'm sorry, but why the fear of Islam? I am always curious.
So that's what I'm coming to, because at that time it wasn't fear of Islam, it was just difference. देखिए हम लोग भी तो करते हैं ना, हमें अगर मैं आपसे पूछूंगी जी जुडाइज्म में क्या प्रिंसिपल्स हैं तो आपको तो नहीं पता सारे.
बिल्कुल ऐसे ही है.
ठीक है. मेरे बड़े अच्छे ज्यूइश दोस्त हैं, मुझे नहीं पता. जब मैं पढ़ने लगती हूँ फिर मुझे थोड़ा बहुत आइडिया होता है, कोई बताए तो पता चलता है. तो अगर मैं ऑटोमेटिकली ज्यूम कर लूँ कि अच्छा जी जवेरिया विद ड्यू रिस्पेक्ट ज्यूइश हैं, और मेरे दिमाग में एक सेट है कि जी सारे ज्यूस हैं वो ख़राब हैं,
ठीक,
तो मैं तो वही आपको देखूँगी ना. ये भी हो सकता है कि अगर मैं मुसलमान नहीं भी हूँ, मैं यूरोप से हूँ, और वहाँ पर उस ज़माने में जब ज्यूइश community was very strong economically, और बाकी जो थे ना वो फील कर रहे थे कि they're excluded from the economic mainstream. तो अगर उस ग्रुप से हूँ, और मैं मिली हूँ कुछ लोगों से जो वो सीख के भी आए थे ऑस्ट्रेलिया में, तो मैं ये भी देखूँगी अच्छा these are the exploiters. But the reality is when Muslims were looked at, it was seen, at least in my view, through the lens of colonizers looking at less modern people. So it wasn't phobia, I say, it was misunderstanding. But gradually what I think is that as Muslims started working through their identities across the world, and some of them decided to use Islam for political purposes, which led to the terminology, which I have a serious problem with political Islam. But it was basically politicization of the religion. As that happened, then people started becoming somewhat aware of religion. And still, I think there were very few who could be identified as being phobic about.
Okay.
For example, I often talk about this story. We're working on a family history of the first recorded Muslim family in Western Australia.
Oh, wow.
Who went from Pakistan, or today's Pakistan, Baksh family. So when they went there, or the male head of the family went there and brought some females, so he wouldn't let them come out because it's a Western society. Somebody reported him, he's holding them as hostage. So the judge got into it. So I often say if it was Islamophobic, he would have said, okay, you're a Muslim, you're out. But because that wasn't there, when this case came up, the judge wanted the Bucks to get someone to support, represent him or give his side of the story. And there was someone who was aware of the Muhammadan ideas, non-Muslim, but he came and he talked about it. And so then the judge decided that, okay, सजा नहीं दूंगा, लेकिन आप उनको रोज रात को बाहर लेके आएंगे, ताकि वो घर के अंदर ना बंद रहें, उनको जरा हवा लगे.
सही.
That wasn't Islamophobic. That was understanding from a different point of view. Where Islamophobia becomes, I think, significant is in the 20th century.
सही.
But more so after Cold War started, or after the Second World War came to an end, decolonization started. So usme, as different countries went through processes where people tried either Marxism or nationalism, modernity, democracy.
Blending it with religion.
Or just playing with it. Ki kaun sa chalega model. And when they started talking about religion, as we saw, say, in Egypt, that's when this idea of political Islam came. And then people started saying, acha, it's different. So, of course, Iranian Revolution, because it hit at the geopolitical interests, it created concerns about Islam. And again, if you look at Afghan jihad.
So Islam became radicalized in all of this.
At that time. But again, if you look at Afghan jihad, which was supported by the West, Islam wasn't seen as a radicalized religion. There wasn't Islamophobia. आप फिल्में देख लेना, तो mujahideen were romanticized.
Yes.
I think what happened was after Americans pulled out of South Asia, and after Osama bin Laden and others, they started raising their voices and they started promoting their narrative of what does, in their view, being a Muslim mean, and came up with this jihadi narrative. That's when the threat perception started emerging. And I still think if 9/11 hadn't happened, probably we would not have seen Islamophobia in the way that we
see it now.
The way we're aware of it. I think the research that we have done also tells us that perception of Islamophobia is greater than the reality of Islamophobia. Now, not everyone would agree with me, लेकिन ये कि 9/11 के बाद चूंकि global level पे, you're either with them or with us, basically said, gee, they're bad Muslims, but they're good Muslims. लेकिन interestingly, the way it was communicated, और वही बात आती जो मैंने कहा था, how you read information influences you get, the way it was communicated, it's a crusade. तो आप लफ्ज़ वापस ले लेते हैं, लेकिन जिन्होंने सुन लिया उन्होंने तो सुन लिया ना. So how people started picking up and how the idea of this terrorists, the whole war on terror came up. So I think then it created this fear that ye Musliman terrorists hain. And the fact that there were Muslim groups, and they still are, who actually feed into that through their actions, has basically meant that Islamophobia hasn't disappeared. We had the rise of ISIS. So Islamophobia grew out of misunderstanding, lack of knowledge, then terrorist acts of 9/11, and then continued terrorism, but then inability of people, not just in the West but elsewhere in the non-Western space, understanding the diversity of interpretation and practices among Muslims. So in that context, Islamophobia has continued to increase. And if you see how it's increased, there are different phases. So it was very high after 9/11, after London bombing. Somehow, poor Spaniards got bombed, but it was kaitna asar nahi hua. But then when we come to ISIS, then it increased. And again, as the right-wing supremacists have become stronger, they have started promoting that. But we need to understand that overall Islamophobia is a product of misunderstanding, lack of knowledge, Muslim terrorist groups, militant groups, and that doesn't represent the totality of Muslims, but they're there, their actions. And then the media's role in promoting that.
Okay.
A media's failure to provide an alternative perception. And as that's happened, it's created the reality of Islamophobia. तो मतलब आप ये नहीं कह सकते कि जी एंटी मुस्लिम फीलिंग्स नहीं है. वो जहाँ पे हम बात शुरू करते हैं कि जी blasphemy, so if somebody consciously engages in that, produces a movie or does something, it's very intentional. It's not कि अच्छा जी आपने गलती से कह दिया था. That indicates there are groups who are trying to do it consciously. But once that happens, there's some people who think कि अच्छा जी सारे के सारे ऐसे ही हैं. So the perception of Islamophobia becomes, at least in my view, greater than the reality of Islamophobia.
Okay, so the narrative emerges stronger than the reality on ground?
It's a feeling that emerges. I think it's a perception that I think about, how we perceive the world. So if we're reading information, KG, Muslims are being targeted, then even if someone is not intending to target Muslims, if they say something that we don't like, we think Muslims are being targeted. That's why I'm hearing what I'm hearing. So Muslims also have a possibility of misinterpreting what's being
reported, put out,
sent our way. But it still doesn't change the fact that we can't say that it doesn't exist. और जिन लोगों पे असर पड़ता है वो तो पड़ता है.
बिल्कुल ऐसे ही है.
मतलब अगर आपकी जॉब नहीं मिलती, अगर आपको सिटीजनशिप राइट्स नहीं मिलते, अगर आपको घर नहीं मिलता कि जी खातून ने हिजाब पहना हुआ, तो वो उसकी जो इमोशनल कॉस्ट जो है ना, वो तो आपको एक्सेप्ट करनी पड़ेगी. इंटरजेनरेशनल उसका इम्पैक्ट होता है कि अगर बाप को जॉब नहीं मिली, माँ को जॉब नहीं मिली.
How that then impacts the entire family, resentment and the reactions.
Yeah, and even if there isn't a resentment, the reality is that if the parents are denied access to labor market, then the children don't have the same facilities and the social capital which others would. And I think we think of Islamophobia only as being directed towards those who are obviously Muslim. I mean, that definitely happens. But even those who don't look Muslim or don't dress up in what we think is the traditional Islamic dress code, even they experience that. And I've seen some people do that. So that reality I'm not discounting.
Yes, certainly.
But I do think that it is important for us, especially as individuals, as groups, but also as policymakers, to place any information coming our way in a proper context and say, first, is it real Islamophobia?
Okay.
Is it real or is it just we think it is? And if it is, how do we respond to it? And what are the different options? Right. Individuals have the same, I think, calculation they need to go through.
We discussed Islam, the identity-making process, perceptions, and the factors, leading us to what we now call Islamophobia. I want to understand now कि ठीक है पाकिस्तान में भी एक phase आया, we saw that it did not do well for us. We call it the Islamization, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, our neighbors India, they too are moving on a line. And I'm not just going to point out India. We had the Ku Klux Klan in the US and every other country. कोई एक कभी कोई religious identity को push कर रहा है, कोई किसी specific political thought को push कर रहा है. Our neighbors, why are they not learning from us then?
I think it's a very good question. You're talking about what's happened in India or what's happening in India. And again, India is not the only country, because Myanmar has also gone through that. You could see signs of that also emerging in other countries. There's been anti-Muslim feelings, not just simply in India, but others.
I mean, with India, it's unfortunately not just anti-Muslim, but anti-minority. To a certain degree, it's not just Muslims, but also Christians. So again, they're pushing forward their own.
The way I look at that situation is that in lots of ways, India is going through the same trajectory, a bit later, as Pakistan has. So देखिए पाकिस्तान बना तो इस्लाम के नाम पे था ना. अगर आप पाकिस्तान को देखें ना, तो we've gone through a trajectory where smaller groups who thought that it was a theocratic state gradually got empowered. Then they got empowered with the use of force. They got force in their hands. They got financial support. And they gradually got to the point where they started threatening the state and the citizens. And excluded minorities. Again, we just have to accept that that's been part of...
That's a process or a situation Pakistan went through.
Yeah. Now, why is it that India hasn't listened to or learned from it? I think that actually I find even more disappointing. क्योंकि अगर आप देखें ना, तो पाकिस्तान तो बना ही नाम पे था ना, रिलीजन के नाम पे. पाकिस्तान never said कि जी हम लोग मुसलमान नहीं हैं. Acknowledge कि जी बाकी भी हैं, लेकिन majority मुस्लिम है. लेकिन इंडिया ने तो सेकुलरिज्म की बात की ना.
बिल्कुल.
लेकिन वहाँ पर भी RSS and smaller groups who talked about Hindutva, they gradually went through the same phase where they started looking at Hindutva as being the only defining feature of Indian identity. अब हुआ ये कि over a period of time, even when different governments were in power, who from BJP, they came in and they partly accepted this, but not totally. So Vajpayee wasn't the same kind of a BJP person as
what we're witnessing now.
So I think the way I look at it is that in case of Pakistan, Islamist groups got energized first by Ziaul Haq and then by the West when they promoted jihadi narrative. And then, of course, groups within Pakistan. In case of India, Prime Minister Modi has taken that role.
He seems to be the vitalizing element.
He's a good orator.
Yes.
He knows how to communicate. And in fact, even what's interesting is कि जब पहले इंडियन लीडर्स बोलते थे ना, तो आपको उनकी ज़बान समझ आती थी कि भाई वो हिंदी, हिंदुस्तानी, उर्दू आपको समझ आती है. अब अगर आप देखें कि जब वो किसी ने सवाल किया प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोदी से यूएस में
अभी
कि जी आपने माइनॉरिटीज़ को जैसे डील किया, तो उनका जो जवाब था ना, वो इतना भारी भरकम था, filled with संस्कृत वर्ड्स, कि मैंने कहा अच्छा ये मेरी तो समझ में नहीं आता, मैं देखूंगी मुझे ट्रांसलेशन कहीं से मिल जाए. तो उन्होंने जो किया, उन्होंने इंडिया को अब ये मेजॉरिटी ऑफ इंडिया को ये फीलिंग देनी शुरू कर दी है कि जी इंडिया इज़ अ हिंदू स्टेट. और उसके साइंस मुझे एट द टर्न ऑफ लास्ट न्यू मिलेनियम एक बहुत अच्छे इंडियन जर्नलिस्ट हैं इंदर मल्होत्रा, उन्होंने एहसास दिलाया था. उन्होंने मुझे किसी आई थिंक आरएसएस और बीजेपी के किसी ऑफिस में भेजा था. कहते हैं ये जाके देखना, तुम्हें पता चलेगा ये क्या कर रहे हैं. वो जो ग्रुप था ग्रेजुअली इज बीइंग एम्पावर्ड. Modi and the laws that he's introduced, including the education language policies, is actually creating a huge shift away from what they stood for, which was secularism. तो वही मैं कहती हूँ कि एक तरह से तो trajectory वही है, but it's even worse in the sense कि पाकिस्तान ने तो कभी claim नहीं ना किया.
Exactly.
आपने claim किया और आप उस society को बदल रहे हैं.
And in 3 phases, we're expecting him, I mean, people say he might win the election, may not win the election, but if he does, so it's the solidifying of that particular. I'm sorry I interjected you, but when we say he's moving towards the direction of a Hindu state, there's an interesting thing that I often see when I read certain Indian writers, authors, or politicians, is that they claim it's the decolonization of India that Narendra Modi is doing. So essentially, Hindutva ko they're bringing up as that warrior fighting against the colonizers. वो language का use और वो सारा Middle East को West Asia कहना और भी मुख्तलिफ चीज़ें हैं सब में मुझे तो खैर बहुत minuscule level पे पता है. But what do you have to say about that? It's like redefining the entire idea of decolonization.
देखिए, again, that's where I'd find some similarities between those who promoted jihadi narrative, Kiji, that's the real Islam. Okay. And now they're promoting an Indian Hindutva narrative to say that's being decolonized. Baba, क्या decolonization?
क्या करना है?
देखिए ना, वो मैं कह रही हूँ कि जो secularism wasn't about being colonized.
Exactly.
It was about India as a multicultural, multi-religious state saying कि जी, yes, there are majority Hindus, but there are others. And we will find a space in which everyone lives equally. Now, it doesn't mean that Muslims progressed as much as they may have progressed otherwise, but it was still different. Now where the problem is, that whole secular identity has been shelved or is being shelved by the government and by the institutions that Prime Minister Modi has set up. And I think that's changing the nature of Indian society.
Exactly.
तो मुझे ये भी मतलब generally मुझे दुख होता है कि जी आपके पास आप तो हमें दूसरा ही शक्ल दिखा रहे थे ना कि सेकुलरिज्म भी चलता है साउथ एशिया में. आपने इंडिया को क्या कर दिया? और अगर कल को मोदी नहीं इलेक्ट होते so it's not the end of Hindutva then.
Exactly.
Just like jihadism hasn't disappeared.
We're still dealing with it.
Yes. So that would be worse. And I think we need to remember, and it looks like as if I'm an Indian sort of citizen who's saying this is what India needs to do, but we need to remember that Pakistan is 1/7 of the Indian, size or roughly. हमारे तो जो मसले हैं वो तो हैं, लेकिन आपको तो नंबर इतना ज़्यादा है, पॉपुलेशन इतनी है. If you, against your history of secularism, do this, the danger.
Self-implosion, perhaps.
Problems. Basically, जब तक इंडिया economically develop कर रहा है, so there will be groups that would know that there's Hindutva-related violation of rights of minorities and the changing of the Indian character, but they won't say anything. But even, let's say, everything goes right and they say something about India, it doesn't mean that even with Prime Minister Modi not being there, the changes that he has brought in would not impact on India. And that's where I think we need to see this whole phenomena, whole development, not as us versus them. ये हमारी पाकिस्तानी identity versus Indian identity नहीं है. It's a South Asian.
It's a regional implication entirely.
And the world implication.
Exactly.
तो आप देखें ना कि जी अगर आप ये ideas promote कर रहे हैं, तो आपके वहाँ पे कुछ होंगे पागल किस्म के लोग. यहाँ पे लोग हैं जो अभी तक जिहादी नैरेटिव से नहीं निकले, तो they'll be threatening each other
unnecessarily.
And what would be the impact on the stability of the region?
Exactly.
Okay? You can't blame everything just on Pakistan, or you can't blame everything on India, but you need to think about these religiously related ideas of identity, when they're pushed beyond a certain limit, when they're empowered by the state and are not checked in a way that rights of other individuals are not violated, you actually set in motion processes that are not democratic.
It's a time bomb.
It is a time bomb. And, the reality is, coming back to what you said about the globalization and what I referred to as deglobalization, in that world, where do we place all these? I just think we are both globalized and deglobalized.
At once.
At once. So when we know that and we say, ये changes यहाँ पे आ रही हैं societal level पे, and how people are being targeted just for being different, what is the long-term impact? और वो impact खाली इंडिया और पाकिस्तान पे नहीं होगा.
It's on the region entirely.
It's even globally.
Exactly.
देखिए, मैं ऑस्ट्रेलिया में रहती हूँ ना, मैंने यंगस्टर्स देखे हैं. अगर मैं 10-11 साल के होंगे, मुझे उम्रें इतनी आसानी से पता नहीं चलती. लेकिन वो बच्चे had a view that was negative towards others.
Okay.
We can't expect that not to happen with respect to Hindu kids.
Exactly.
There's already research being done.
Exactly. In fact, there's Dr. Zahid Shaim, if I'm not wrong with his name, but he also recently did a study on this particular subject pertaining to the impact of Hindutva on Australia. And from there on, I was interested to know, all right, what are the global ramifications here? You would wonder, it will just stay in India? No, it's moving out. It's the same with Pakistan, India, any country, as a matter of fact, in South Asia. Afghanistan's instability continues to impact us. What's going on in Myanmar continues to impact the region as well. And so you very rightly pointed out that it's not about us versus them, but us versus this entire situation.
Yeah.
And perhaps if only the understanding comes to the other side, maybe that could do us some good. And on that note,
can I just say something?
Oh, sure.
Not just simply the other side. That understanding also
has to come from us as well.
Pakistan
Yes.
Because we can't talk about उससे एक बात करें ना जब आप खुद क्लास हाउस में रहते हैं, ठीक है? तो we also need to rethink ourselves.
Come to the same page, both sides. In fact, I absolutely agree, and I would endorse on a policy level as well that for any policy to benefit both sides, we have to come to terms as well. With that being said, I would take you towards a conclusive question, and it's a big one, because then I will ask you, okay, how do you then unravel the entire process of radicalization? And given that you have also worked on Muslim Women Agency, and I would also like for you to give me the perspective of how in this current time zone, पहले तो ये होता था ना, जिहादी भी यही कहते थे कि खातून की खैर कोई जगह नहीं है. But in the case of a lot of terror groups, not just restricting them to Islam or Hinduism, but a lot of terror outfits have demanded women's support as well. So with such a situation, how do we pursue de-radicalization as a policy, and then how do you see the role of women in this particular idea?
Thank you very much. That's my really favorite subject underneath all that. कि जी अब करें क्या इस सारी situations से? So I'll really go back to, I think I may have shared that story with you कि बचपन में मैंने कोई हदीस पढ़ी थी और मैंने अम्मी को बताया तो हंसी. मैंने कहा, ये मैंने हदीस पढ़ी कि हर हदीस ठीक नहीं होती, मतलब दुरुस्त नहीं होती, तो मैं सोचना चाहिए, पढ़ना चाहिए कि भी ये वाकई वैलिड है, ऑथेंटिक है या ज़ईफ़ है. तो when you start looking at what I do today, I think a defining role to my mother.
Okay.
Because had she not inculcated commitment in me to say, I'm not going to just accept what comes my way. I'm going to look at what's there. And I may not still come to the right conclusion. Nobody says, I'm perfect. I'm not. But at least I'm committed to myself. I'll get all the data that I can and then make my decisions. Then make my opinions. So I guess it's my way of saying that if we look at radicalization and de-radicalization, तो सबसे बड़ा जो रोल है ना वो आपकी फैमिली प्ले करती है, उसमें आपकी माँ प्ले करती है. अगर हम देखेंगे जी रेडिकलाइज्ड ग्रुप्स, तो अभी हमें ज़्यादा आइडिया है कि जी they're focusing on women, but the research that I did on Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jamaat-ud-Dawa actually alerted me to that at the turn of the new millennium. That they were looking at women as supporters of jihad. And then overall it moved into, in some Islamist militant groups, but then also, as you said, other groups, into highlighting the role of women, even as active agents of radicalization.
Exactly.
तब सिंगापुर में, so not Singapore, Indonesia में आपको नजर आएगा. Western countries, United States, there's lots of groups. Even in Western Australia, I'm aware of. वो militant नहीं है, but the women are very active in there. So I guess where I want to bring it down to is that in the whole space of radicalization, women have been playing a role as supporters, but it's being increasingly acknowledged and utilized by militant groups, mostly led by men. So in that space, what role can women play in de-radicalizing? So that's where I started with my mother's story. If the women are empowered from the word go, if they're given access to education, which I think I'm lucky that I was born to that mother who made possible that all 4 of us, boys or girls, got education. If the women are given education, or girl child is given education, given same facilities as a boy child, then you build that capacity when they grow up to question what comes their way, or question what comes in the way of their family members. तो माँ, बहन, बेटी, बीवी, उन्हें नज़र आ सकता है कि अच्छा जी मेल मेंबर्स इस डायरेक्शन में जा रहे हैं. तो what can we do to change it? So women have a very strong role, but they even have a strong role in changing the contextual framework in which these ideas evolve. कि अगर आप खामोश बैठी रहें और मर्द सारे बाहर बात कर रहे हैं कि जी औरत का काम सिर्फ घर में रहना है और सोचना नहीं, बोलना नहीं, और आप उसको क्वेश्चन नहीं करती, तो आप वो कॉन्टेक्स्ट सस्टेन कर रही हैं.
Sort of endorsing, even if you're not.
You are endorsing.
But the silent, basically, acceptance of the norm.
So it's a structure that's being supported by women by accepting the existing narratives of Muslim womanhood.
Okay.
If you want to change that, you have to raise your voice. ताकि idea what does it mean to be a Muslim woman changes. तो जब अगर आप active भी होंगी political space में, public space में, आपके antenna ज़रा हैं,
काम कर रहे होंगे,
घर में भी करेंगे, because then you can see and then you can link these two. तो फिर आप ये नहीं सोचते कि अच्छा जी पुत्र जा रहे जिहाद पे, तो ठीक है,
बिल्कुल ठीक कर रहा है,
वो तो उसका मसला है ना, जन्नत में हमें ले जाएंगे, लेकिन इससे बाहर वो मेरा काम नहीं. लेकिन अगर आप सोचते हैं कि जी मेरा बेटा गलत रास्ते पे जा रहा है, मैं उसे कैसे रोकूं, क्योंकि उसे सिर्फ मेरे बेटे को नहीं, उस सोसाइटी को नुकसान पहुंचेगा जिसमें मैं हूँ, और उससे और भी नुकसान पहुंचेगा मुसलमानों को.
बिल्कुल.
तो if you're not aware of that, then you won't work on it. So I guess I'm very strongly in favor of promoting women's agency. And it's not just simply Muslim women's agency. I think women's agency across religious and ethnic divides can create possibilities of understanding, and it can provide sisterhood networks that prevent these phobias about whatever the other is. I don't know if it's policy relevant or not, but
I think, ma'am, a lot of times the softer side of things are rejected as irrelevant. But I think this is where we tend to lack and lag as well in terms of dealing with issues that started off as softer ideas, eventually hardened into actions. I mean, if that's the right thing to say, because then you have to battle out ideas with ideas. You can try force with force, then ideas with ideas. Again, how proactive you are would, I guess, bring the success factor to it as well. Because मैंने at least जो समझा है of someone whose memory of radicalization or Islamophobia or just general things stems from these years, right? Like लाल मस्जिद हो गया, फ्रांस में कुछ हो गया, डेनमार्क में कुछ हो गया. But how will I counter these? Whether I continue to accept information coming my way or whether I will challenge it, as you say. Or on a policy level, how are we dealing with it? I think important matters that you've pointed out.
And I think it's also how would you react to it?
Exactly.
Would you, I mean, you mentioned that, but I think the reaction, the kind of reaction, would you just give statements or would you get someone to, अच्छा भी जाके मारो किसी को, or would you say, let's find what our history tells us?
Exactly.
So, actions, ideas are so closely related that I think that agentic activism would enable you to make a difference.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And ma'am, the topic is, of course, not something that we can just dissect in this time, but it was a pleasure to host you. And
Thank
I would
you.
love to learn more from your research and work that as you continue to pursue your ideas. I was very much inspired by one thing that I want to actually make it a point in this podcast is कि the first thing madam asked me was कि हम लोग अपनी ज़ुबान में क्यों नहीं बात करते. That has me thinking अभी तक, by the way, even as I was speaking, I kept thinking of words कि अच्छा इसको मैं वापस किस तरह अपनी ज़ुबान की तरफ लेकर. And I think you've pointed out something important in terms of our national identity as well, the force of language in developing ideas, pushing ideas, and even in de-radicalization. आम बंदा अंग्रेज़ी में तो बात नहीं कर रहा, उस तक अगर आपने climate activism पहुंचानी है, de-radicalization की activism पहुंचानी है, तो आप किस तरह पहुंचाएंगे? सिंध में जाके आप उर्दू ना बोलें तो बेहतर है, उनको उनकी लैंग्वेज में बताएं, पंजाब में उनको उनकी लैंग्वेज में बताएं. तो I guess the closeness does come from the language as well, and perhaps our activism would be much more swifter if we pursued it the right way and not just for Stratcom on the global level. At least that's what I learned from you today in our personal conversation as well.
No, thank you. क्योंकि मैं हमेशा सोचती हूँ कि हम मतलब I thought we were going to finish, but I just
we're almost done.
Okay, I just look at Pakistan. So again, going back to my mother, she patronized Urdu literature. तो मुझे तो उर्दू अदब ना पढ़ के वैसे दिल खुश होता है, और मुझे दुख होता है कि अब मैं पाकिस्तान में आती हूँ ना, तो जो एजुकेटेड तबका, जो एलीट क्लास से वेल ऑफ हैं, उनके बच्चे अंग्रेज़ी बोलते हैं, और जहाँ पे भी वो अंग्रेज़ी बोलते हैं, और उन्हें जो आपने कहा था कि भी हमें इस्लामिक हिस्ट्री का कम पता है, उन्हें इस्लामिक या अपनी हिस्ट्री का नहीं पता, उन्हें दूर का पता है.
बिल्कुल. तो
उसका नुकसान क्या होता है? नुकसान तो ये कि जी आपको अपना नहीं पता तो आप बाकी क्या समझेंगे. और फिर ये कि अगर आपको अपना ज़मीन का नहीं पता तो आप कैसे फ़ैसला करेंगे कि इस पे होना क्या चाहिए. एक तो मुझे इस बात का दुख होता है. दूसरा ये जो ना अब एक तरह से लोगों में फ़ख्र आना शुरू हो गया है, और उस पर मुझे बड़ा गुस्सा चढ़ता है कि जी मुझे तो उर्दू नहीं आती. मैं कहती हूँ आपको कैसे उर्दू नहीं आती? आपकी नेशनल लैंग्वेज है, आपको आनी चाहिए, आपको अंग्रेज़ी भी आनी चाहिए, क्योंकि ये भी कोई बात नहीं कि जी मुझे इंग्लिश नहीं आती. लेकिन जो मैंने नोट किया कि एक तो ये फ़ख्र से कहते हैं कि नहीं जी उर्दू तो नहीं मुझे आती, और जो डिसएडवांटेज फैमिलीज़ हैं वो भी ये सीख रही हैं. तो वो भी मैंने देखा, बच्चे जो बहुत इतने अमीर घरों से नहीं, वो भी वही पिक करके तो इनकी बात में अंग्रेज़ी के अल्फाज ज़्यादा आना शुरू हो गए. उसका नुकसान क्या है? एक तो ये है कि जी आपको अपनी आइडेंटिटी ख़त्म हो जाती है. दूसरा जो आप इंफॉर्मेशन आपको मिलती है ना, वो आपको, और अब मैं इंग्लिश इस्तेमाल करूँगी, इट्स मीडिएटेड थ्रू अनदर लैंग्वेज जो आपके अंदर नहीं है.
बिल्कुल.
समवन हु इज़ lucky like you who's been educated in the English system, आपके लिए तो चलें ठीक है, आप इंग्लिश समझ जाएंगे, लेकिन आपको पाकिस्तान का नहीं पता होगा. जिसको पाकिस्तान की ज़बान का पता है और उसको ये दूसरे आइडियाज़ आप दे रहे हैं, तो उसको तो जो आपने कहा तो नहीं समझ आएगी. और उसका दूसरा नुकसान ये होगा कि उनको अपने सोचने समझने के तरीके ख़त्म हो जाएंगे. इन द लॉन्ग टर्म इसका पाकिस्तान का नुकसान है, क्योंकि लैंग्वेज जो है ना, उसको रखना, उसको प्रमोट करना, उसको बच्चों को सिखाना, खुद सीखना, मेरे ख्याल में ये हमारी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है. मैं ये नहीं कहती कि जी उर्दू छोड़ दें,
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल.
लेकिन जो सबसे बड़ा नुकसान मुझे लगता है, अगर हम इंग्लिश पे इतना फोकस करें और उर्दू या बाकी लैंग्वेजेस पे नहीं करें, तो वही जो आपने बात की थी, जब हम आप लोगों को बात बता रहे हैं तो
वो डिलीवर कैसे होगी, उन तक पहुंचेगी कैसे?
आप उनसे कहना कि जी मैं आपको डी रेडिकलाइज कर रहे हैं, तो वो कहेंगे भैन जी की गल कर रहे हो. मतलब सोचे ना, व्हाट डज इट मीन, यू अंडरस्टैंड
क्या हो भाई.
वो आप कहें कि जी इस्लाम इज नॉट अ वायलेंट रिलीजन, तब आपको पता है कि आप
क्या कह रहे हैं. लेकिन वो जो आइडिया हम एक्सप्लेन करना चाह रहे हैं, उसकी एक्सप्लेनेशन मेरे पास भी अंग्रेजी में है और उर्दू में नहीं है. तो ये आई थिंक कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट चीज़ें हैं, preferably in policy level can be engaged.
Absolutely, yeah.
So thank you so much, ma'am. Again, I have questions, but this could then go on. And thank you so much for being part of this podcast. It was wonderful hosting you. We hope to see you again on another episode of Policy Beats.